Good evening and welcome to ICAS 4 Symposium Veritas 2022. I'm Shinja Kim, President and Chair of ICAS, and I'd like to thank all of you for joining our program today. And it is my great pleasure to introduce our special guest speaker, Matt Pottinger, who will address the issues and challenges facing the Korean Peninsula and the U.S. national security. Matt is a distinguished visiting fellow at the Hoover Institute and chairman of China program at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He served at the White House for 4 years in senior roles on the National Security Council staff, also as a Deputy National Security Advisor from 2019 to 2021. In that role, Matt coordinated the full spectrum of national security policy. Before that, he served as a senior director for Asia, where he led administration work on the Indo-Pacific region and in particular its shift on China policy. Before his White House service, Matt spent the late 1990s and early 2000s in China as a reporter for Reuters and the Wall Street Journal. He then fought in Iraq and Afghanistan as a U.S. Marine during 3 combat deployments between 2007 and 2010. Following his active duty, Matt founded and led an Asia-focused risk consultancy and ran Asia Research at an investment fund in New York. And of note, on May the 4th, 2020, Matt contributed to ICAS his remarks on China's May the 4th movement. Ladies and gentlemen, we are so happy to have Matt Pottinger here with us today and hope you enjoy the program, and let's welcome Matt Pottinger. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. It's great to be with you and to be with a lot of friends. I just saw Chip Gregson's picture screen by for a second, and so I wanted to give a special hello and thanks to him. A little story: when I was working as a journalist in China, writing for the Wall Street Journal, this is back in 2004, or I guess early 2005. I developed the crazy idea of joining the U.S. Marine Corps and giving up journalism and checking into officer candidate school at Quantico. Chip Gregson was a general officer in the Marine Corps at the time, who I asked to write a. Oh, did it go? Did the sound go out? Sorry about that. I don't know if it looked like the video went out for a second, but I was just saying that Chip Gregson took a gamble on me and wrote a recommendation letter so that the Marines would consider me for officer candidate school when I was in need of an age waiver because I was 31 or 32 years old. So anyway, it had a huge impact on my life. Thanks for taking a gamble, Chip. And it's really good to see you and some other friends as well.
By the way, Chip is in Tokyo right now.
Oh, lucky you. And good morning to you there. One of the nice things about the fact that we're finally most countries are starting to adapt to COVID enough to finally start reopening. So I was in Tokyo just a few weeks ago for the first time since I think mid 2020. I visited Taiwan in late summer, and I'll be going back to Taiwan again in just a few weeks. And so, I think those are all topics we should talk about because as we look at the regional picture, we see that the dangers have not abated. In fact, with the important rise of Xi Jinping and his securing a third, which really may be a third and fourth 5-year term, because he hasn't named anyone or elevated anyone who looks like they might be a future successor to Xi Jinping. So really, we might only be at halftime with Xi Jinping. His first decade is behind us, and he's just beginning his second decade as China's dictator. So I think there's a lot to talk about, and what all of this means for the Korean Peninsula, what it means for South Korea. I think that South Korea, more important than ever right now, and its alliance with the United States is more important than ever, given those changing factors with Xi Jinping and his no limits alliance with Vladimir Putin, the possibility of an upcoming nuclear test in North Korea, the fact that another long-range missile was tested again after many years of hiatus. I really see an opportunity for South Korea to keep building on some of those ideas that have persisted and grown, irrespective of who's in which party and which president is in power in South Korea. What we've seen is a strategic shift towards the broader Indo-Pacific region by South Korea, and a de-emphasis on investment in China and towards Southeast Asian economies. So again, there's an opportunity now for South Korea to play a stabilizing role, a deterrent role, and a growing leadership role, not just in Northeast Asia, but across the Indo-Pacific region. And so I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. Before we go into a Q&A and a discussion, I thought I would just sort of preview a little bit an article that I've just written, and that'll be coming out very soon in Foreign Affairs magazine. And what a couple of co-authors and I have done is looked at 10 years of Xi Jinping's speeches and his textbooks and the documentary films that he had produced and distributed under his auspices. And as my colleagues and I, Matthew Johnson, who's a historian at the Hoover Institution, and David Fife, who was my colleague, he was at the State Department when I was working on the National Security Council staff. As we looked through the totality of Xi Jinping's speeches and put in chronological order some of the most notable things that he said, we were really struck, even as we were mining these quotations, we were struck at actually how clear of a picture and how significant the scale and scope of ambitions on the global stage is represented in Xi Jinping's own words. And so it's a reminder of how important it is to actually pay attention not to secondary sources, but to the primary sources of dictators and autocrats. As we look back at some of the speeches and essays that Vladimir Putin wrote and issued in the months and years leading up to his re-invasion, his armed assault on Kiev on February 24th of this year, it's not so much that he left clues. He really left a full sketch of where things were headed. And I am quite concerned that Xi Jinping has given us enough of a sketch of what he wants to get done, that we should be, all policymakers, business leaders across the region and around the world should be quite concerned about what Xi Jinping has in store in his third and fourth terms in office. So I'd love to explore that in this discussion. But with that, maybe we should just turn to Q&A, and I'm interested in where you want to take the conversation. How much do you want to focus on the peninsula, and how much do you want to zoom out and look at the region and some of South Korea's formidable neighbors?
Well, thank you, Matt. Now, before we get into Q&A, allow me to make a short, brief comment. ICAS is not an agent of any government or foreign principal or foreign powers. No foreign funds involved in ICAS activities and programs. I want all of you to be aware of that. Thank you. Now, Joe Bosco, go ahead.
Great.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi, Matt. It's great to see you again. Thanks for doing
Joe,
this.
great to see you. I'm really glad to see you.
Thank you. I wonder if you, Matt, if you would share some thoughts on what's happening in China with these apparently massive protests that are kind of escalating across China. Do you think it would be inappropriate, too provocative of the Biden administration to be a little more assertive than it has been in supporting the protests? And is this kind of an inflection moment for Xi Jinping in terms of his longevity? You talked about third and fourth terms. Maybe he won't even survive long enough for that. What are the prospects of that? And should the U.S. be encouraging that kind of development?
Yeah, Joe, look, I think U.S. policy, the policy of our government and the policy of American citizens should be to make common cause with the Chinese people. It should be to side with the people in China. And so I would really like to see more vocal support and recognition of the courage of those people who are taking to the streets. But these aren't naive people. These are people who are risking everything to stand up and demonstrate, to raise their voices literally on the streets of Shanghai and Beijing and on campuses across China, in the capital of Xinjiang and Urumqi. These are people who know what is at stake for them personally to be taking to the streets the way that they are. And we should be in awe, absolute awe, of the courage of these people who are showing up and raising their voices against a system that even George Orwell, Huxley, William Gibson, Eugene Zamyatin, pick your 20th century dystopian novelist. They could not have dreamt up a totalitarian system that is now being rapidly put into place and being test-driven by Xi Jinping. And so I would really like to see leaders around the world, particularly the world's leading democracy, and leaders of other democracies around the world, speaking up to show their appreciation and just sheer respect for people who are standing up right now to call out a system that is treating people like zoo animals. People are being welded in. I mean, if you look at over the last 3 years since COVID first emerged, and certainly with the Shanghai lockdowns and with lockdowns that are rolling across China right now, it is typical to catch glimpses and snippets of video of dabai. That's the term, big whites. It's the security forces and the public health officials wearing those white containment suits, going around and welding shut people's doors, welding shut the doors of whole buildings that may have been one of the contributing causes to the people who died in the fire a few days ago in Urumqi. It may be the case that they were unable to get out because they were welded in to their building. It may also be the case, according to some of the reports emerging from China, that the fire trucks could not get close enough to the building to put the flames out because of either police barricades or the fact that all of the cars that were parked on the street had dead batteries because no one's been allowed out of their homes for more than 100 days in that city because of these lockdowns. So look, what does this mean for Xi Jinping? There's no question that this is the most significant set of protests that we've seen since 1989. It may be that they start to peter out quickly. It may be that they are snuffed out quickly. Beijing has many means at its disposal, short of the kind of violent military force that was used in 1989. The Chinese security forces have availed themselves of billions of dollars of anti-riot gear, but they can also listen in on all the communications that are happening on most apps. And so it's a larger budget for internal security in China than exists even for the Chinese military. And that's the second largest military budget on earth. And it's getting pretty close to the US budget. So there's no question this is very significant. China has protests all the time, but you've not seen protests emerge simultaneously in multiple cities directed at the central government. And to see those young people stand up and even say, in some cases, Xi Jinping should step down is quite a remarkable sight. It's not something that we've seen in more than a generation. I don't know what that portends. I think that the thing that we should keep in mind is that Xi Jinping, in a speech that he gave, this is one of the speeches that I quote in my article that's coming out this week. Xi Jinping gave a major address last year in November of 2021 to the 6th plenum. This was a speech that was kept secret for a couple of months, and then it was never translated into English. And as far as I know, the Western press completely missed it. But it is a very combative and disturbing speech, in which, among other things, he commended Deng Xiaoping for violently crushing the 1989 protests. So this was just a year ago. Xi Jinping, in fact, it was the only time he mentioned Deng Xiaoping's name was to say that the party took decisive measures. That was his quote: decisive measures to put down demonstrations in 1989, and that in Xi Jinping's telling, that saved the country, it saved the party. And I think that we should be very clear-eyed that Xi Jinping is the kind of person and has the kinds of his stated enough times in his rhetoric that we should be clear-eyed that he would be willing to use that kind of force again if less violent measures don't deliver or disperse the protests that have emerged. Protests are funny things. These were spontaneous. And it may be that they spontaneously die down again, but it is a serious signal that people are fed up and that Xi Jinping is gravely miscalculated by not procuring vaccines from the West, from Germany, from the United States when they were offered. He had the opportunity to inoculate 1 billion people 2 years ago using the most advanced mRNA vaccines. He chose not to do that. And one of the, as I was trying to figure out why he did that, we found a quotation from Xi that goes back to March of 2020 when COVID was still a young pandemic. He said that China will control biotech technologies, the core technologies, especially technologies related to COVID. And I think that was a signal that went out that said, you're not going to use foreign technologies to deal with this. We're going to have our own core technologies. But lo and behold, here we are 2.5 years later. They haven't approved any mRNA vaccines, and so he's painted himself and his system into a corner. And he now faces a really horrendous choice. He can either take his boot off the neck of the Chinese economy and let hundreds of thousands or millions of Chinese elderly who are under-vaccinated die, or he can continue to lock down and snuff out the Chinese economy, which is clearly in deep negative territory. Look, Joe, and last point, the U.S. is going to get blamed anyway for what's happening in China. So why would we restrain ourselves in pointing out the truth of the situation there and showing common cause and really love for Chinese citizens who are suffering and who are now taking these brave steps? We saw overnight that the senior-most body in the Politburo, senior-most official and committee that deals with legal and political matters, including the security apparatus, has put out a fairly severe statement saying that China is looking into infiltration and instigation by hostile forces. Yeah, this means that China is going to go back to its playbook and claim that this is all being instigated by foreign black hands led by the United States, that this has nothing to do with an authentic expression of organic suffering by the Chinese people. So we should not keep our voices quiet.
Thank you, Matt. Is Bruce Bennett out there? If not, Patrick Cronin, please, go ahead. Patrick?
Well, thank you, Matt.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I can ask China and your opinion about Xi Jinping in light of your article, but also then get into a question that deals with North Korea. The question on China is the extent to which you think Xi matters as opposed to the party. And if you go back, and I haven't read, I'll look forward to your article in Foreign Affairs, go back to something like document number 9 in July 2012, which was such a clear foreshadowing of kind of crackdown on the West and Western values, even though some people at the time, as you know, argued Xi wanted to gather power so he could be reformed, undertake reforms. And we've seen how that's played out. I think probably very much in agreement with your view on this. The question I have on North Korea, and it comes from a discussion I've had with Chinese recently, is do they have any red lines on North Korean behavior? They've given more or less a blank check to Kim Jong-un in this unprecedented missile campaign. And it's just not clear whether they're willing to rein him in at all. In my latest discussions with the Chinese, they did hint that there were overlapping interests and there were limits. Not that they wanted to coordinate with us, but yeah, they do have limits. But I'm just wondering, in your longer view take on that issue, on viewing the Chinese, how significant are potential red lines on North Korean misbehavior, provocation that could destabilize the peninsula? Thanks so much.
Patrick, it's great to see you. And on the first one, in this article that'll come out in the next day or two, you'll see that I actually wrestle with the very exact question that you just asked at the start, which is how much of this is Xi Jinping and how much of it is the party. And I talk at some length about document number 9 as well. I agree with you. That was a very important and prescient sort of foreshadowing, I guess, of where Xi Jinping has led China over the last 10 years. Here's where I come out on it. It is that we should not overestimate the role of Xi Jinping, because as you look back in time to the time before Xi Jinping rose a decade ago, and you start revisiting some of those original source documents. I'm thinking, for example, of Rush Doshi's book that came out last year called The Long Game. Rush now works at the NSC in the Biden administration. I think he did a great job in his book of re-examining original source documents, speeches, memoirs, things that hadn't been translated into English, to piece together that really the broader goals of the party have been consistent. Even going back to when Deng Xiaoping was paramount leader, and some critics of Xi Jinping in China refer to him as the great accelerator, and it's because they believe that he's accelerating the demise of the party, but others have said no, he's actually accelerating the long-standing objectives that predate him and which will succeed him if the Communist Party stays in power. But all of that being said, there's no question that leadership matters in this system at least as much as it does in any other system. And you can see Xi Jinping's personal imprint on everything that's happening right now in China. And I have very little doubt that if you want to know what's happening in where China is headed, the most important person to pay attention to in both his words and actions is unquestionably Xi Jinping. And so that's why we've taken quite a lot of time and care to try to assemble what his worldview is, what his ambitions are in his own words. With the situation with the peninsula, one of the things that hasn't really been discussed publicly very much is that over the course of 2017, which was the first year of the Trump administration, we were quietly working behind the scenes with China on North Korea, and had as good, maybe the high point of cooperation. It was low key. We didn't make a big deal of it. Most of the diplomacy was never announced. But what we were able to do, if you think back to 2017, you had this very unusual period where China, even Russia, and all of the other members of the UN Security Council followed the US lead unanimously in signing 4 UN Security Council resolutions over the course of 2017 that did significant damage to the North Korean economy in order to punish it for the missile test, the successive missile tests, and the nuclear test. I believe that was the 6th nuclear test that they did. If I remember correctly, it was probably September of 2017. These were not your garden variety slap on the wrist UN Security Council resolutions. These were progressive steps to eliminate the export economy available to North Korea, to make it hard for North Korea to export coal, other minerals, seafood, laborers. And then the most remarkable of all was after the final test, near the end of 2017, when there was another long-range missile, we persuaded Beijing to go along with, and this was not easy diplomacy, I can tell you from experience, but we persuaded Beijing to go along with a ban on basically the expulsion of North Korean laborers from China and Russia, and also a first step, which was China agreed to cap the amount of oil that it would make available to the North Korean economy. That was a significant signal and set of steps. Now, what happened after that? President Trump elected to, having put very significant sanctions on North Korea, he elected to also open the door to top-level diplomacy with the North Koreans, which was unprecedented as well. And so what you had was an inversion of the usual model of the previous 30 years, which had been mid-level negotiators talking to the North, painstakingly trying to put together an agreement, and then agreeing to withhold or even reverse sanctions on the North Korean economy in exchange for those mid-level talks that would result in an agreement that North Korea would then, at an opportune moment, tear up, in effect, and repeat the whole cycle in order to acquire new concessions from the West. So Trump flipped it on its head. He said, "No, we're going to try to strangle your economy, but we're not going to do mid-level diplomacy anymore because it's proved to be a waste of time for the first Bush administration, the Clinton administration, the Obama administration, second Bush administration. But what I will do is talk to the one guy in the system who can make decisions, and that's Kim Jong-un. I'll talk to him myself." So he proceeded with what ended up being 3 meetings between the two leaders. At that point, with the first meeting in Singapore, Beijing took a step back from its cooperation. Partly, I think it was reflexive out of a fear that if things suddenly slid towards a much more cooperative framework between the United States and North Korea, that China would be losing its own influence and leverage, and being concerned that we're going to move into some new kind of paradigm. So China's diplomacy overcorrected into a less helpful posture. There was a lot of activity to sort of undermine the same UN Security Council resolutions that China had helped write and pass. Oil transfers out at sea, smuggling of letting workers stay longer than they were allowed to, and so forth. And that's sort of where we've been ever since, I think. And the missile tests, at least the long range tests, stopped. The nuclear tests stopped until this current sort of reopening of Kim's old playbook. So, the one thing that I would say, though, is that with the new leadership in South Korea that we have right now, there's an opportunity that I hope the South Korean government will take up to do exactly the same thing that I was just advising our government to do, which is to make common cause with people who are suffering. And the North Korean people are suffering. I think that South Korea should be doing a lot more to stop restraining efforts by people who have escaped from North Korea to South Korea, do more to help communicate with people in North Korea, make it easier for people in North Korea to communicate with one another safely. It's not easy to do, but I don't think we've tried very hard also. And really there should be a much more forward-leaning posture on the part of all governments, including South Korea's, to make common cause with North Korean citizens.
Thank you, Matt. Tong Kim. Tong, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for doing this for us. My question will be a continuation of discussing what China's interests are in North Korea, whether they're taking use of North Korea, because their official position has always been China would be most interested in stability in the Korean Peninsula and peaceful talks and peaceful resolution of the nuclear issue as well. But do you believe China, if China really wants to help South Korea or United States to resolve the nuclear issue, whether China really can do it? Because it seems to me China has been changing its interests. There was a time when Jiang Zemin was in power, and they were concerned if North Korea let alone developing these nuclear weapons, then there will be proliferation followed by South Korean nuclearization in Japan and all countries that fail. And this is said, well, we have no influence on Kim Jong-il or North Korea. He changed his mind, and that was the beginning of the six-party talks. It seems that their position has changed. Do you believe China is less interested in rearmament of Japan, nuclearization, or South Korea going nuclear for that matter as well? But the question really is whether China can really help and resolve the nuclear issue if it wants to, and what it takes it to do.
Thanks, Tong. My impression is that Beijing does not believe in its heart of hearts that Kim could be persuaded, the Kim family regime could be persuaded to give up nuclear weapons. And so I think it's much more about maintaining a status quo that is knowable and less of a wild card that Beijing would have to scramble to contend with. Now, why did Beijing cooperate with us as much as it did, even though it was quiet? But we had quite a good degree of cooperation over the course of 2017. One of the key reasons was that President Trump was intimating that he was considering military action against the North Korean regime. I think that Beijing became more cooperative with the U.S. as a way to try to work with us and against the idea of the United States taking military action against North Korea. So there's an important lesson in that. I'm fairly confident that was a really key factor here. I don't think that Beijing, basically Beijing was worried that if the U.S. took military action, we'd be remaking the order in ways that Beijing wouldn't have a direct vote in, and which would be quite risky for China's security interests as well. So, but I don't think that your question about why isn't Beijing considering the knock-on effects of some of its actions in not doing more to restrain North Korea, or even its threats to attack and annex Taiwan? Both of those scenarios point other countries in the direction of at least considering acquiring their own nuclear deterrent. And I wasn't able to make that big of an impression on Beijing by trying to paint that future picture for them, that, you know, what will you think when Japan has a nuclear arsenal? South Korea has acquired a nuclear arsenal. Perhaps Vietnam has acquired a nuclear arsenal. That was not sufficient to significantly change the direction of their diplomacy. The threats of U.S. nuclear, or of U.S. military, conventional military action were quite, those really did catch their attention, though.
Thank you. Don Kirk, are you there? Don Kirk? If not, David Lee, please.
Hi.
David?
Yep.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much for your comments and answers and for being here. Considering the increasing political unrest and protests going on in China that was mentioned earlier, do you think it's possible that we see major escalation in quote unquote problem areas like Taiwan specifically to consolidate domestic power, akin to what some believe that Putin has been doing currently in Russia while the war in Ukraine rages on? Or do you think the unrest can be handled more quietly like it's been done in the past?
David, thanks a lot. Look, one of the there's a terrific historian who lives in Melbourne, Australia, Jeffrey Blaney. I think he's in his 90s now, and I've actually corresponded with him over the last few years. But he wrote an incredibly insightful book decades ago that's been updated a couple times, called Causes of War. And what he did was he looked at the last 400 years of warfare everywhere. I mean, he really went incredibly deep in looking at the causes of war and the causes of peace that followed wars. And one of the many insights that he squeezed from his analyses was that countries, contrary to the popular idea that we sometimes refer to in the US as the wag the dog scenario, or sometimes they're called scapegoat wars, the idea that an autocrat or any leader who is under immense pressure at home because of domestic turmoil, domestic unrest, chooses to launch an overseas military adventure to distract his population. In fact, Jeffrey Blaney could not find evidence that has ever convincingly occurred. In fact, what he saw was the opposite, that if a country was in domestic turmoil, it was less likely that the leader was going to turn towards an overseas conflict. But there's also a corollary to what he found. The corollary is, if the country that the would-be aggressor, in this case Beijing, if the target, in this case Taiwan, is in some kind of turmoil, or if a third country that would be inclined to come to the target's aid, in this case the United States coming to Taiwan's aid, if the United States were in domestic turmoil, that significantly enhances the likelihood that a would-be aggressor decides to roll the dice and go to war. So if these protests erupt again, re-erupt or start to spread, I actually view the odds of a war over Taiwan dropping quite significantly, at least for the period that things are out of control. If the United States ends up becoming really distracted with our own political pathologies in the 2024 election cycle, that will increase the odds that Beijing chooses its moment of opportunity to try to annex Taiwan. So that's my view. I think Blaney's onto something with that. That said, China is not currently in a moment of widespread social turmoil necessarily sufficient to dissuade Xi Jinping. I think if things get worse, he's going to have quite a lot on his breakfast plate that will put Taiwan onto the back burner.
Thank you. Larry Nix. Larry.
Thank you, Sanju. Can you hear me?
Go ahead.
Mr. Pottinger, you mentioned wars. And one of the things that has always struck me about the U.S. wars since World War II is whenever the United States gets into one of these wars, right away, politically and in the press, and even in public opinion generally, the question arises, what are the Allies doing? Are they contributing enough? And what seems to happen is that there doesn't seem to be much of a look at this before these wars start on the part of the US government. The Trump administration and the Nord Stream pipeline is an exception to that statement, but for the most part, wars start, and then the political class or even the bureaucracy in our government starts to raise the issue, what are the Allies doing? And certainly after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, to its credit, the Biden administration moved pretty quickly to get much greater involvement by our NATO allies in supporting Ukraine. So with regard to Taiwan and South Korea specifically, is the question of a war involving the United States to defend Taiwan, and what would our allies, specifically South Korea, contribute to support the United States? Has this question really come up within the executive branch, within NSC, the State Department, policy planning, or as in so many wars in the past, is this frankly the South Korean role? What would the US expect of South Korea in terms of military support? Is this still an open book that would not really be negotiated, planned, discussed, agreed upon until the war actually happened? Is this still an open book?
Yeah.
We really can't say anything about at this time. Or has a serious look, been taken at South Korea's role, either within your administration, the Trump administration, or more recently in the Biden administration?
Yeah, Larry, it's a great question. And I think that until Beijing's investments in its military capability really started to gain traction over the last 15 years, what you had was a long-standing policy and really a dominant U.S. capability in the Western Pacific that meant South Korea would not need to be involved. And in fact, we would want South Korean forces to be focused on any opportunistic probing by North Korea, and really it would be a question of U.S. forces flowing from our bases in Japan and further to the east of that, coming to Taiwan's aid and dealing with the threat. The problem, obviously, is that Beijing has an immense capability now that in my view calls into question all sorts of assumptions, including about the role of South Korea in a conflict. I should state, though, that the decisive variable, in my view, and I defer to Chip Gregson to add to my remarks or even replace them. But to me, the variable, the decisive variable, is the role of Japan, and whether Japan would be willing to finally really prepare for a war over a Taiwan scenario, demonstrate through its actions and through its signaling that it would be involved fighting shoulder to shoulder with the United States and with Taiwan. Because if Japan really were to commit and to signal that it was willing to commit, it would deeply complicate China's war plans for Taiwan. I think that Japan really is the decisive variable, and that there's an enormous amount that we should be doing in order to help encourage Japan to say more about what it's already thinking and what it's even beginning to do with things like its plans that we're going to hear more about next month to double its defense budget. Finally, a decade late is better late than never. But so that takes us back to South Korea. What's South Korea's role? Well, what we know is that South Korea is going to be living in a completely new era and in a much more problematic paradigm if Taiwan is annexed by force by the People's Republic of China. Korea's got serious problems on its hands at that point. And so I think that the book should be open, as you said, to use your metaphor, to visiting and revisiting the roles of U.S. forces on the Korean Peninsula and of Korean forces on the Korean Peninsula in the event of a conflict over Taiwan. But I don't think those conversations have progressed in a really significant way.
Well, I agree with you, but in the case of Japan, going even back into the Trump administration, haven't there been some major serious U.S.-Japanese meetings and discussions about Taiwan scenarios?
The short answer is yes. The longer answer is, but there's a lot more that we need to be doing in terms of training together and in terms of communicating to the Japanese public and also communicating to Beijing that this really is an existential threat for Japan and that Japan is not going to sit on its hands. And given that that's the case, because I've had enough conversations behind closed doors with Japanese officials over the years and even quite recently to know that Japan's not going to sit on its hands. So it'd be better for Japan to talk about and start demonstrating how badly it could complicate Beijing's assumptions about how easy a war would be now in advance of Beijing pulling the trigger, so that we can actually derive deterrent effect from that. But yes, the conversations are a lot more interesting now than they were 12, 24, 36 months ago between Washington and Tokyo. Chip Gregson, if you're still on, is there anything that you wanted to add?
Thank you, Matt. Tara, go ahead. Tara.
Hello. Yes, good evening. Hi, Matt. Good to see you. Can you hear me?
Tara, it's good to see you. How are you?
Oh, good. Well, you know that I'm going to talk about South Korea. I think in this context, how much influence China has over South Korea, I think that's palpable by how little we know about it or how little it is covered by the media or discussed. And I'm going to make a list just to prove a point. It's going to be more than 3. South Korea, of course, is a country that had the world's first Confucius Institute. So that's outside of China. And there are at least 24. So it's the country that has the largest number of Confucius Institute in Asia. But that has been around for a while. Also, I just spent a few months in Korea doing research. And what I noticed is that there are CC cameras all over Korea, much more than maybe 2 years ago when I was there. And we know that these are made in China. And, with these, we always wonder what happens to all the data. It may end up in China. But that is something I noticed. Also, there's a wind energy project in South Korea. It has not begun yet, but it's over a sea that is right next to Gunsan Air Base. And the problem is that right to develop that, right to build wind turbines, that is given to China. And I see a huge problem with that in terms of air operations, because that could be in the way, or that could be even used to monitor, surveil the airbase, or do other types of activities. So those are not really covered in the media, but that's what's going on. I also went to Central Korea, Myeongdong, which is it's right in the middle of old downtown of Seoul. And what I noticed is the Chinese embassy has become larger. It actually has taken over. It bought some of the land, precious land, the shopping area, and now that is inside the walls, inside the compound of Chinese embassy, which has this multi-story high-rise apartments or high-rise building plus school plus ground. So what we're seeing is this expansion of Chinese presence in the middle of Seoul, while we are relocating everything out of Yongsan to Pyeongtaek. So the U.S. is leaving. U.S. is going to outside of Seoul, while China's presence is increasing. So and I'll just draw a couple more. Also, Chinese can vote in South Korean local elections. So that's for city mayors, provincial governors, education superintendents, and all the lawmakers that are at various levels that's below the national level. So that is another concern. What I heard while I was in Korea, it was that a lot of the politicians, whether they're in the opposition party or the ruling party, some of them are influenced by Chinese money and other methods. So we have that kind of situation in South Korea. So I think if we, just because the administration changed, I think it's too early to feel everything's back to normal in South Korea. I think these are, again, not covered, and you have to ask why aren't these covered? Why aren't these mentioned in the media? I think media also has some influence by China as well. But so in that context, what kind of what do you think we U.S. and the U.S. Rocket Alliance as the allies should do to counter this threat, which is it's not military threat, but it is asymmetric and it's irregular. So what are some of the options, and what are some of the things that we should be thinking about?
Yeah, well, this is it's a similar story in places all over the world, including here in the United States. You might have seen that Canada, a news story broke that Canadian counterintelligence found that the Chinese government was, they alleged, or the reporting alleged, that Chinese government was funding at least 11 national level candidates in Canadian elections, and was funneling money to them. In Canada, elections aren't very expensive. I mean, $100,000 is usually sort of the total amount. It's not like here in the United States where these crazy amounts of money get bulldozed in. But China was putting significant amounts of money into elections, and also contributing clandestinely staff to help run campaigns for people. So you caught my attention with all those examples, but in particular the one where Chinese citizens residing in South Korea are allowed to vote in your elections. That seems like an area that's ripe for public debate, I guess. Look, if you go back to what the Australians were dealing with, when my friend John Garneau, who was an advisor at that point, 2015, 16, 17, and 18, to the Prime Minister of Australia, he found that there were significant amounts of Chinese government money that was being directed by United Front actors. That is, people acting as agents of the Chinese Communist Party, but funneling massive amounts of money into national elections across Australia. The first step is you have to expose it, and I hope that there are intrepid reporters who feel like they have the support of their editors, and certainly they'll have the support of their readers to expose those kinds of corrupt programs, but then also to put forward laws like Australia adopted, transparency laws that go beyond America's own foreign, rather crusty and old and out of date Foreign Agents Registration Act. But I guess the bottom line is there are a lot of countries that are now doing this. They're contending with similar problems. They're contending with foreign investment screening. The Israelis have just done a revamp of theirs. because of similar kinds of situations to what you described, where military infrastructure used by the United States when it visits ports or is based there is suddenly vulnerable. So I would look at the examples that others are going through, and I'd be happy to talk offline and give you some samples of some good resources for that.
Okay.
Thank you. Is Sunny Park out there? Sunny? It's not. Is Chip Gregson out there still? Chip Gregson?
I am, thank you.
Go ahead, Chip.
Well, I
Welcome,
just sent a
Chip, go ahead.
note in response to Matt's query about the role of Japan. Number one, I agree. Number two, I note that Japan is only 63 miles from Taiwan, a closest point of approach, the island of Yonaguni, where Japan already has where Japan already has self-defense force deployed there in response to developments in and around Taiwan. Japan's role would likely be robust defense of their own territory and support of U.S. forces. And I note also that a lot of Japan's equipment is interoperable with ours. Their F-35s, for example, their V-22s, and the Maritime Self-Defense Force vessels that they have. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you,
great.
Chip. And Nobuo Tanaka from Tokyo.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I really I cannot agree more to Chip and Mr. Pottinger about the role of Japan. Yes, we recently decided to increase our budget, doubling it, and certainly decide to buy the Tomahawk missiles from you. And suddenly these are the big development. And I am the energy expert, so I'm a bit concerned about the future of the nuclear power in Japan. Yes, Kishida-san, Prime Minister, decided to expand the operation toward next year, but can he deliver is really a challenge. And also, I always feel that Japan should have a nuclear propulsion submarine, not a weapon, but nuclear propulsion submarine, just like Australia is trying to do with AUKUS arrangement. And do you agree that, if Japan is moving to that direction, the US can help us to develop the nuclear propulsion submarine, facing the challenge of China in Taiwan Strait, etc.? That maybe we cannot be in time in the short term, let's say, possible invasion in a couple of years' time by China, but as a longer term, strategic preparedness of Japan, having the nuclear submarine is a very, very important option for us.
Tanaka-san, thanks so much, and good to see you. I haven't looked closely enough at the nuclear sub issue. I know that the South Korean government under President Moon had a similar aspiration to develop a nuclear propulsion submarine capability, and I'm not expert enough on the issue to make an informed endorsement or denial of the utility of those capabilities. I would just simply say that these are immensely expensive capabilities, and they are capabilities that take an enormous amount of time to develop and to maintain and so forth. That's not to say that it doesn't make sense. I just haven't looked closely enough at it. I think that for Japan's immediate budget concerns, it should be prioritizing, just as we in Taiwan should be prioritizing those capabilities. Tara used the word asymmetric a minute ago, but really, relatively inexpensive, replicable, stockpilable, and mobile systems that would put Chinese war plans and Chinese ships and aircraft at enormous risk. And that by front loading those sorts of capabilities, we have a much better shot at deterring a war that I fear would be quite catastrophic for everyone involved and people on the sidelines as well.
Thank you. Greg Skeleto. Greg, come in. Greg?
Yes,
Go ahead.
here I am. Thank you very much. Matt, great to see you.
Greg,
How are you?
it's really, I'm so delighted that you're on, and it's been too long. Very good to see you.
We'll catch up. Great to see you, Matt. Two very quick questions. To what extent do the stability and survivability of the KWP depend on the stability and survivability of the CCP? Second question. Over 3 decades, across multiple administrations, across both sides of the aisle, we have dealt with very serious political security and military issues while sacrificing human rights on the altar of those very important issues. What is preventing a human rights upfront approach to North Korea? You're there at the very top of government. We work together. I know that you care. I know that you perfectly understand this. So what is preventing human rights from being integrated into our approach to North Korea policy? Thank you very much.
Greg, it's your first question, which is really about the symbiosis between the CCP and the Korean Workers' Party, the party of the Kim family. It's a really good question, because I think it would be an immense psychological crisis and credibility crisis for the Korean Workers' Party if look, the KWP has always been derivative in many ways of whatever the big other communist party is on the scene at the time. The Korean Workers' Party was really a project of Stalin, and then of course it became it was directly protected by the Chinese Communist Party and its decision to go to war on the Korean Peninsula to push back American and UN forces. I just think it would be it would be untenable, I think, over time for the Korean Workers' Party if the Chinese Communist Party were to no longer be the single monopoly party in China. So when Kim Jong-un went to visit Xi Jinping for the first time this was after President Trump had agreed to go have his talk and meeting in Singapore in early 2018. Kim visited China at Xi Jinping's request, and Kim, it was partly tactical. It was feigning this sort of younger brother kind of dynamic in order to flatter Xi Jinping. But nonetheless, there is that dynamic. There is a younger brother kind of element to this. I mean, the North Koreans are wholly dependent on China for their economic, what exists of an economy there, for their electricity, for their oil, for what exports are able to be smuggled out. All of that is symbiotic. Their financing is symbiotic with the Chinese Communist Party. I just don't think could they continue on like Cuba? Is this just this island? Yeah, maybe, but they would become even less relevant pretty quickly, I think. Now, to your question about human rights, look, I'll speak very frankly that in late 2017, when President Trump gave his address to the National Assembly in Seoul, it was a human rights speech. Recommend dusting that speech off and taking a look at it. It was quite a striking message that was very much driven by the human rights situation. President Trump met many times with escapees from North Korea, and I think that the frank part was to say that there was not a mutual agreement with the South Korean government at the time that was an approach that they wanted to take hand in hand with Washington, D.C. The Moon administration stepped back from human rights as an issue on the Korean Peninsula, and that made it much tougher to present an effective united front and to do things that I think might have really put the situation more into play in a way that would have been better over the long term. But there's an opportunity to return to that kind of approach if the Biden administration is game and the South Korean government is game.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Matt. Fatima Azumi, go ahead quickly.
Good evening. My name is Fatima. I'm a MA student at the University of Nevada, Reno. I'm focusing on the reign of Kojong Gwangmuje for my thesis. And so the reason why I'm very interested to hear you speak is, so when President Biden went and had the trilateral talks with China and Japan and Korea, how do you think that the historical memory politics that are still present, especially amongst the both conservative governments in Korea and in Japan today, will affect the partnership between the three? The U.S. is a willing ally, and for the most part, both countries are willing allies of the U.S., but how might their partnership, Japan's and Korea's partnership, affect this alliance moving forward, especially since this might be strategic again, with China becoming more of a regional hegemon in the area?
Fatima, thanks so much. Look, it's this is an issue that is not easy, if at all possible, to solve, but it's something that can very much be managed, and in ways that respect the memory of people who were victimized during the war, but also that respects the desire on the part of the Japanese people and people in government at high levels in Japan to move forward in a partnership with South Korea that would benefit both sides immensely. I was very glad to see that President Biden has had the trilateral meeting, that people on his team have had trilateral meetings at their levels. It's very important. We did it also usually quite quietly. When H.R. McMaster was National Security Advisor, I think he convened South Korean and Japanese counterparts at least 5 times for sometimes multi-day meetings to talk about the trilateral opportunity, and that paid enormous dividends in helping prevent emotions and other factors from sort of making this the foremost issue in the relationship between Japan and South Korea. It's something the U.S. has to play that role as the treaty ally of both of those countries, which are not allies with each other. It's really important. I'm glad that President Biden's doing that, and I do think there's an opportunity. I hope that the leaders in Tokyo and Seoul right now, given this opportunity, take those bold steps, and that the Korean public shows some forbearance in looking to see what's possible in ways that still preserve the memories of people who were victimized during the war.
And I'm so sorry, you mentioned that previously this type of trilateral partnership meetings would happen more quietly. Do you think that the Biden administration is making some noise to signal anything towards China and Beijing to show that they're working towards, and hopefully to kind of signal China to kind of maybe back off of Taiwan after what they did in Hong Kong, and obviously the human rights violations in Xinjiang as well?
Yeah, on Xinjiang, the most vocal governments so far have been in the Western Hemisphere. I would love to see that change. I mean, this is, to my mind, I can't think of another human rights crisis that exceeds in scale and sheer inhumanity what's taking place right now in Xinjiang. I mean, this is a stain on the century already, and we're only, we're not even a quarter of the way through the century. This is a bad one. I would love to see more vocal support for the Uyghur people and what they are doing. It's not just Uyghurs. I mean, if you look at the images just from overnight of police now stopping random people in Shanghai to look at their phones, confiscate or fine or arrest people if they have a virtual private network app on their phones so that they can actually communicate with the outside world. You're starting to see Xinjiang and that model exported to the other provinces of China. And I think that is one of the reasons why so many Chinese people stood up over the last few days, and in solidarity with people in Urumqi, the capital of Xinjiang. It transcended ethnic divisions and those kinds of issues. This was about people standing up for human dignity and not being treated anymore like zoo animals.
Thank you, Matt. Would you take just one more question, please, Matt?
Yes, sure. If you have time.
Okay.
Sure.
Kristen Yun, go ahead. Unmute your button.
Okay, can you hear me?
Go ahead.
Yes.
Thank you so much for inviting us. I'm from an organization called the America Korea United Society. My question is about, again, South Korea. And since the new leadership take over in South Korea last May, since the last May, two groups like right-wing people and left-wing people, they are protest continuously, almost every weekends. And now more people join in two divided groups. And I feel like the whole country is divided completely, two different groups that never met. And that atmosphere also expanded to the United States. So now Korean Americans in US, they actually starting all those. So my question is, how does the US government see this current situation in South Korea, and what kind of effort can the US do, or what kind of effort they are being making to resolve this issue?
It's a good question. I don't actually know the answer. I don't know enough about the situation, and I haven't talked to the Biden administration. I do talk to people sometimes in the administration, but I haven't talked about this, about the situation with these protests. But if others have an idea of where that's headed and what the U.S. might be able to do on that front, I'm open-minded to hearing ideas.
Matt, I can give you a quick rundown. Basically, the one side, saying left and right. That's one description. Basically, the group that is on the left, it's led by mainly KCTU, Korean Confederation of Trade Unions, which is labor union. It's a million plus. It's very pro North Korea and pro China, and they've been warning this. They're basically protesting for Yoon to step down. So that's what they're doing on that side. And then the other side is there to support Yoon, to sort of like counter the demonstration calling Yoon to step down. So that's what that is right now at this moment. I think a lot of people were, especially people on the right, they were aware that this was going to happen. And those on the left, they did threaten that they are going to do this. They're going to try to, do a large demonstration to get him to step down. And right now, they're using Itaewon, the Itaewon death, as they're using that as justification. It's not a good justification at all, but that's what they're using. So it's like the candlelight demonstration of 2016, but it's slightly different, but the actors are the same, especially on the left.
Thank you, Tara. Thank you, Matt. Ladies and gentlemen, time is up. The meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much, Matt. We'll get back to you.
It's great. Thanks for
Thank you.
having me. It's great to
Thank
see
you.
friends in one place. And so please keep in touch. I look forward to it.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.